As you've gathered, I am not Nancy Duncrack, who is on the flyer, but Nancy is also a great resource to you. She works with Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts and runs their pro bono program, which is starting to provide free and low-cost attorneys to farmers and ranchers who are thinking of conservation easements. So, as Jonathan mentioned, I am working to establish a statewide agricultural land trust that's dedicated to preserving agricultural land, keeping it in production, and passing it on to the next generation. And Peter Carnegie is our board president, so glad to have Peter in the room today as well. My other job is as a hazelnut farmer, and my family is 5th generation in the Willamette Valley, 3rd generation on our hazelnut farm in Yamhill County. We're just to the southeast of Gaston. And my grandpa there, Ken McAdams, put together our farm from 3 different homesteads in the 30s. Our base farm there is about 350 acres, and we still have some other holdings, bring us about 400. But we also, my dad wanted to keep that together and continue farming after his parents passed. In order to do that, he had to come up with millions of dollars to pay off his 2 sisters who were going to be dividing that estate equally. Our estate, might have been worth about $4.5 million, and he was going to be in debt $1.5 million to each sister when my grandfather passed. So in order to plan for that eventuality, my dad looked at 80 acres that were up on Bald Peak that we didn't farm ourselves anymore. It was too distant to bring our tractors up to. We were leasing it out. And who here remembers Measure 37? I think that was in 2004. Under Measure 37, my dad filed claims to subdivide that parcel into 5-acre lots. And that's not because we wanted to see 14 houses go up there. In fact, none of us can drive by it now. It just brings us to tears. It's because we wanted that property to be worth about 5 times as much as it was worth as a 180-acre plot used with agriculture as its highest and best use. So in some ways, that was our sacrificial lamb. That property went to my aunts. It was worth a lot more with those subdivision rights on it. And my dad was able to only pay off $1 million loan to both of them together, which was the remainder of his debt to them. So I tell you that only because I think our family had a situation where an easement could have come in handy. Maybe instead of creating and using development rights, maybe we could have sold the development rights that we had already on our property. And that's what brought me to this work and got me curious about easements and sort of the framework that I'm going to use in explaining my understanding of easements to you today. So an easement, Joe had a definition up as well. This is a definition from the Land Trust Alliance that a conservation easement is a voluntary legal agreement between a landowner and a land trust or a government agency that is authorized to hold an easement that permanently limits the use of the land. So this is a way to look at your property. And it's in the case of a conservation easement, that is to protect the conservation values, which for working land easement includes the agricultural use of that property. So a working land easement allows that property to be used for agricultural or forestry production, while understanding that by keeping this as open space and not paved area, you're providing a lot of conservation benefits as well. I just want to point out here, covenants are another tool in Oregon that are temporary. They're 20 to 50 years, and that limits the development of the property for that length of time. So how do conservation easements work? This picture is helpful to me as attorneys, and I don't know if Joe mentioned this legal concept before, but we think of property not as just one big block of land, but as a bundle of sticks. And each of those sticks is a different property right that you can take out of the bundle and sell. So that bundle might include one of the 7 different ways that you can build housing on exclusive farm use. That might include one of the 50 plus ways that you can do non-farm uses on exclusive farm use land, like aggregate mining or churches or airstrips. So each one of those rights is a little stick that you can, under a conservation easement, talk with a land trust about which sticks you don't need to have on your property, which development rights would you not need if you were going to keep it in production. So that might be putting housing on the property, subdivision if that's allowed, Measure 37 rights, aggregate mining, And in the green square there, those might be the rights that you sell off of the property. As you see, the remaining rights in white include your ownership of the land. When you sell an easement, you still own that land. It's yours to sell, it's yours to give to your heirs, it's yours to do anything, any property rights that are legal and that you didn't permanently give up with the easement. Does that make sense? So what is the value of an easement? When a land trust or a soil and water conservation district, which often hold easements in Oregon as well, are talking with you about what kinds of rights you want to give up, one of the things to consider is, well, does that right have an appraisable value? What land trusts will do is what's called a before and after appraisal, which actually uses two appraisals. The first is an appraisal of your property as is. So what is the value of it now with all of the development rights that are currently on that property, maybe a measure of 37 or other rights. And in this example, that property is worth $1 million. And then you look at, an appraiser looks at what the value of your property would be if you released some of those rights, if you gave them up permanently to a land trust. So what would the value be if you took off the measure 37 subdivision rights? In this case, that is $600,000, just as a rough estimate. And then the value of the easement is the difference between those two. So in this example, that would be $400,000. It just depends on which rights you choose and how valuable the property is before and after. And this kind of an appraisal is done to calculate the value of an easement, whether it's for cash or whether it's for donation as well. The federal government requires a specific kind of appraisal. So why would you put an easement on your property? I wish that we could have put one on our property to keep that land permanently available for agriculture. You might also do it to protect it from subdivision and development generally, or you might have conservation objectives as well. And that doesn't have to be for the whole property. There might be a riparian area that you would like to protect as that riparian area, and under an easement you could get compensated for making that sacrifice of deciding to keep that land forever in conservation, that portion of the land. You might also do it to create liquidity of your assets. So by that I mean farmers and ranchers are land rich, cash poor. Oftentimes, most of the value of a person's estate is going to be in agricultural land and agricultural equipment. So it can be hard, especially when the elder farmer passes away, to come up with the cash that you need to pay the estate tax, to pay the attorney's fees, to pay the kids who aren't coming back to the farm. Where does that cash come from? An easement can be a good way to get cash from your working land's real estate while being able to keep it in working lands and keep it in your ownership. So it also provides affordability for future generations. And if we look back at those two appraisals, the appraisal afterwards, after the easement's been conveyed, is usually lower, and is always lower. The sales price is sometimes lower. Honestly, in some real estate markets, the sales price might be relatively similar. It's just that the appraisal values is lower. But if you do take that lower appraised value, that can make that land more affordable to the next generation who's buying at agricultural value rather than at highest and best use, which might not, in all cases, be the best for agriculture. So this is a little graph. I have an infographic of this as well that I'm happy to send, but instead of parceling off land and sort of having that be the sacrificial lamb generation after generation in order to have that liquidity, what an easement allows you to do is sell property rights that exist on all of your property and to get cash out of that while keeping that remaining property intact. Other reasons to do it are financial considerations, and Joe is getting into this as well, so I'll try not to be redundant with him, but you have several options under financial considerations. One is to get cash. So there's several grant programs that I'll talk about that will pay cash in exchange for conservation easements, working lands easements. There's also a tax deduction for donation, and just know that you can combine these things too. When you convey an easement, say the value is $500,000, you can do $250,000 in donation and receive that tax credit. You can do $250,000 for cash and receive that. So you can choose depending on the grant program. And then, as Joe was saying, favorable estate tax treatment because an easement reduces the total value of your estate. So for funding sources, ASEP-ALE, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, agricultural land easements, from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, is the top program used throughout the nation to fund working land easements. It grants, in most cases, up to 50% match, but in certain areas, especially sage-grouse habitat in Oregon, you can get up to a 75% match from this program. And it is very well funded and has strong bipartisan support from the federal Congress. So it's receiving $450 million per year through this farm bill for this program and the Wetland Reserve program, but it's significant dollars. One of the things about this program, I mentioned that it was a 50% match. That matching money has to either be landowner donation or non-federal sources. So here's an example of an easement. 50% might be from ASEP-ALE, 50 up to half of the portion that ASEP-ALE doesn't pay for can be landowner donation. So up to 25% of the total easement value can be taken as donation, and then the remaining amount can be non-federal funding sources. So that last quarter is sort of the leverage point. Where is that money coming from in order to bring that federal funding into Oregon? Oregon has a easement match program called the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program that was passed in 2017. It provides up to a 75% match, so you can use this in combination or on its own. And it is designed to fit with the ASEP-ALE federal program. The only problem is that it's unfunded. We are a coalition of organizations is attempting to fund this program in the 2020 short session and to have some pilot projects going so that we can access those federal dollars before they go away. And who knows what the next farm bill will bring for this program. So it's largely untapped in Oregon. We've only received 0.19% of those federal dollars, whereas the 28 states that have funded easement programs have leveraged 3.7 times more funding than the states like Oregon that do not have a state match program. If you're interested in participating in that project, you can speak to Jonathan or myself. So just for example, Delaware has received more than 10 times as much funding as Oregon, despite the fact that it's smaller than many of our counties. So income tax incentive, Joe had mentioned this as well. So farmers and ranchers who donate a conservation easement can deduct that entire value from their income tax. And they have some special requirements. So a farmer and rancher is someone who receives more than half of their gross income from the trade or business of farming. So it can be businesses also related to agriculture to a certain extent. And the easement must allow the land to remain available for agriculture as well in order to qualify for this deduction. One of the cool things about this deduction too is that you can spread it out over 15 years. So say you donate $500,000 worth of an easement value. Well, maybe you don't have $500,000 in income tax liability in that same year that you donate that easement. The federal government has taken this into consideration and allowed farmers to spread that over 15 years. So I'm going to go into a graph that displays that, but first I wanted to say that non-farmers and ranchers can deduct up to 50% and can only take that in the year of deduction. So that's the benefits that farmers receive in that case. So this is an example. Say in that earlier example we had, you donate the value of $400,000 of easement value. Well, this is 15 years. In this chart, the blue is the deduction, the orange is the remaining taxable income. So in the first year, this person chose only to take $10,000 of that deduction. Well, in the second year, they chose to take $50,000 or half of their total taxable income with that deduction. If you have a negative year, you don't get to use that deduction, but you can use it in years maybe later on when you have a positive year, and you can take it all the way up, as in year 6 over here. You can take the deduction entirely. So I just show this to show that it's as flexible as you and your tax professional want to be with how you spread that out over 15 years. There are also estate tax incentives. So on the federal level, for those who qualify, heirs can exclude up to 40% of the value of the land and the easement from estate taxes. And that's capped at $500,000, but that is available for federal estate tax as well. And heirs can donate an easement after death, but before the tax return is filed, and receive charitable donation for state and federal. Yes?
Does the person who buys the property get the unused deduction for the easement?
If the easement is spread out over 15 years and the property is transferred in those 15 years, but before the tax deduction has been used up, can the tax deduction pass on to the next owner? That's a really good question, and I don't know whether the deduction attaches to the donor or to the property. My guess is that it attaches to the donor, but if you want to give me your name and contact afterwards, I can get back to you with an answer. Unless anybody else knows. Okay. So favorable estate tax treatment. As Joe mentioned, an easement reduces the value of the total estate, unless you just convert it to cash, in which case your estate still totals the same amount. It's just sums in cash, more is in cash than was before, transferred from real estate. So it can really reduce the value of the estate if it is donated, if that makes sense. It can also be especially helpful if the size of your estate disqualifies you from the natural resources tax credit. And I'm about to describe what that is. But to frame this, some farmers and ranchers are reluctant multimillionaires. We, I think, lead pretty honest and low-cost lifestyles, and yet the assets that we happen to be sitting on are increasing in value and quite valuable. The natural resources tax credit and some other tax credits, some folks are getting disqualified because the value of their assets are too high to allow them to use that credit. So just going into the natural resources tax credit, it is for farming, ranching, forestry, and or fishing, for families that have, for an estate that has assets that are in those categories for more than 50% of the asset value of that entire estate, and the adjusted gross estate. In order to use the credit, the natural resource business has to have been operated by the decedent or their family members for 5 of the 8 years before that person's passing. It also needs to be operated and used for natural resource business purposes for 5 of the 8 years after that person passes. Otherwise, the state can reclaim that tax credit at a prorated rate, I believe. Unless it's, Joe, can they reclaim all of it, or is it prorated? It's prorated.
Nellie,
Yeah,
a question that we've gotten a few times. Mm-hmm. Does the operated mean like they're leasing it out for farm purposes, or do they have to be kind of a principal operator for that?
Joe, what do you?
Lease it out.
It can be leased. Do we have folks on who are listening in?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
It's a question that's come up, so I just wanted to.
Thank you. So, and family member is defined by statute, but it does include adopted family members and I think adopted children and children-in-law. So here's the catcher for some families: is that the adjusted gross estate must be under 15 million. And that the tax credit is limited to the first 7.5 million of the natural resource property. So if you have 16 million, you can't use this natural resource tax credit at all, and you're on the hook for the entire amount of estate tax. If you have, say, 10 million in natural resource property, you can, and you are under 15 million in all of your the estate's assets, you can only take that credit up to the first 7.5 million of the natural resources, if that makes sense. So I have a couple of graphs that might describe how an easement can be helpful in this situation. So say your estate is over 15 million. Here, this estate is 16 million. If you want to convey an easement on all or part of your property, you can just choose which parcel, and that easement might be worth 2 million or any amount more than 1 million. That brings the overall value down to 14 million in this case, and you would be under that threshold and able to apply for the natural resources tax credit. Again, you would have to donate enough so that you no longer have those assets and that the value of your total assets, including cash, are below that threshold. So you couldn't sell an easement for 2 million, take the cash, and then still be under the threshold because your total assets would be over 16 million. So there's the cutoff of 15. If you wanted to be able to claim the full amount of your natural resources credit, so the 7.5 million, in this case, the natural resources are worth 9 million, so you would not be able to take a credit for 1.5 of that. In this case, so if you were to sell or donate $2 million of an easement, you could still take cash, and your total value of your natural resource assets in this case would be 7 million. So you're just converting some from natural resource to non-natural resource in order to allow you to take that full credit. Or you could donate the easement and bring your natural resource values down to 7.5 or below, if that's what you choose to do. In working with the natural resources tax credit, I advise everyone strongly to speak with your attorney about that, because in how you transfer your assets, you never want to have your natural resource assets be below 50% of your total estate. So if by selling an easement that changes some of your farmland into cash that's no longer specified natural resource asset, if that brings your natural resource assets down to below 50%, then you can no longer use the natural resources tax credit at all. So here is 50% or above, you can still use natural resources tax credit, but if natural resources assets fall below 50%, you cannot use that credit. So that's just a matter of talking with your attorney just to make sure that however you're moving your assets around, you can still qualify for this credit if you want to use it. The steps to granting an easement. First thing is, as Joe was saying, have your team on board. So having an experienced attorney and accountant who can work alongside you through this transaction, but also through how it affects the rest of your succession plan and income taxes. Then choose an easement holder. There are about 19 easement holders throughout the state that hold working land easements or consider holding them. One place to look for them is the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts website. There are also some soil and water conservation districts that hold easements, so you might reach out to your soil and water conservation district. I'll be talking a little bit about Oregon Ag Trust as well, and we're also a resource. Then the easement holder, so whoever you decide to work with, whoever you trust to hold this easement in perpetuity, will do a title search. They could do a survey to understand what the property lines are, and they'll inventory the current land uses and resources on that property, just creating a baseline to understand what the values are on that property. Then you'll begin the process of drafting and negotiating a CE or conservation easement. In that process, you will look at the different land uses that are available, decide which ones you would prefer not to have on the land in order to conserve its agricultural uses, and which ones you would like to keep and reserve for the future. And that process can take a long time. This is an important decision involving your real estate and future assets. So you should allow it to take a lot of time, or as much time as it needs. And then you draft the easement itself. So the preamble describing what kinds of conservation purposes are important to you, what rights you as a landowner reserve for yourself on that property, what rights you're extinguishing or conveying, giving up. And then what are the affirmative rights of the easement holder? That usually includes the right to monitor the property once a year, and then any administrative provisions. So afterwards, easements involve annual monitoring by that land trust. That involves sometimes photo points. It involves sometimes GIS mapping and just looking at the property to understand, was there a trash heap that was dug here that wasn't here when we first put that easement on the property that might be in violation? Or, have the neighbors been encroaching in this area, just to understand and make sure that, that your wishes are maintained in perpetuity. The landowner continues day-to-day management, so doing anything that you would normally have done on that property as long as it's not prohibited. And then any enforcement action, if something goes on. This is here from Nancy's slide, but from many of the land trusts that I work with, law enforcement always needs to be an option, enforcement of those easement provisions. Land trusts always attempt to have conversations and to remediate first. So Oregon Agricultural Trust, the organization that Peter is our board president, it's our sole purpose to hold working land easements. We also are interested in working with landowners in other ways to preserve land. Some landowners don't want to convey an easement, they simply want to donate or sell the land. In that case, we can put an easement on it and either sell it at a lower agricultural value to the next generation or do a long-term lease. So we are willing to be flexible depending upon what the landowner's needs are. And it's really our passion to make sure that these lands transfer from generation to generation, whether or not you know the next farmer of that land or whether or not they're related to you, just sort of trying to understand how matchmaking and succession services can also be a part of this process. So we are launching in January of 2020. We're going to have a launch party on January 23rd at Bethel Heights Winery right outside of Salem, so come join us there. I'm also going to pass around a sign-in in case you want to receive periodic updates. But so we will be launching. We are also, in addition to preserving land, we advocate for programs on a statewide level that also support the preservation of ag land, including the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program, which I mentioned, that has a match fund for conservation easements. So we will be joining with a coalition and doing that work in 2020. So holding working land easements and working with landowners on other real estate transaction, education about easements and land loss. I think the general population doesn't understand what is at stake if we lose our food security and the land that we depend on and the rural businesses that can thrive on it, and then advocacy as well. So we only have 5 minutes. I have a case study here. I can take questions and then go into this if there are no questions. Yeah?
I have a two-part question. Is there any way that your heirs or somebody you sell your land to after you've done whatever easement you do, can they buy those easements back? And or can a city, say you're butting up into a city, can the city annex your land, in their 20-year plan and then become part of the city boundary? Or is it like a state agency or county, can they annex your land, eminent domain or whatever, for highway, pipeline, power lines, something like that?
Right. So future owners and heirs cannot resell those rights unless there is impossibility, which is a really tough standard to prove, unless it's impossible to meet those terms. Some cases that I've heard that might happen is if a property was in an urban area or right on the border of an urban area and really did become impossible to run an agricultural operation. But even in that case, that it might be difficult to prove. The intent of the federal funding and the federal tax deduction is to make these agreements as permanent as possible, and there is a very, very high standard for changing them. In terms of eminent domain, nothing gets in the way of that. So this is just a private contract between a landowner and an organization, and it cannot stop an eminent domain.
So I think we actually might just
Stop right there?
Stop
Okay.
there.
If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I have my card, and feel free to sign the sign-in. But thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.